My grandma used to tell me scary stories when I was little. There's one I'll never forget. I was 10 years old when grandma came to live with us. It was about 6 months after Grandad passed away, and I guess, looking back, she must have been lonely in that big house of theirs. Rattling around with only the grief and memories for company. So despite a few protests from Mum, my parents took her in. There were no protests from me. None at all. Grandma was loud and fun, and I loved her. She had an almost limitless supply of boiled sweets, and she'd always slip me a couple whenever she saw me. She was always the first to stick up for me when I got in trouble, too. But it was her stories I loved best. Grandma had all kinds of stories. Stories about growing up during World War II, and stories about the things she'd get up to with her friends on the South Coast after her family had been evacuated. Sad stories, funny stories, adventure stories. But it was her scary stories that were my favorite. Grandma had lots of scary stories. She told me she dabbled in the occult when she was a teenager, trying out Ouija boards with her friends. Tarot cards, fortune-telling. All that stuff. Most of the stories I'd laugh off or forget about not long after she was done telling them, but there were a couple that really did spook me a bit. I was only 10 at the time, you have to understand. And Grandma certainly knew how to bring the stories to life. She'd shut off the lights in my room, so only the glow of the night sky shone through the curtains, and she'd shuffle in real close. Close enough so I could see the wrinkles on her face and smell the boiled sweets on her breath. Close enough so her deep blue eyes could stare straight into mine. She must have given me nightmares with a few of those tales, but now years later there's only one that I can still remember. Only one that stuck with me. The story about the shower and Mr. Longfingers. Grandma told me about Mr. Longfingers one night after I asked about her baths. Grandma used to love her baths. She'd spend ages in them. Light candles and incense and lie in the tub humming to herself until the water turned cold. It drove my mum crazy. But when I asked her why she loved them so much, she said it was the only place she could relax. It was the only place that was safe for her to relax. You know, people like me, who are more sensitive to certain things, we have to have baths, she told me seriously one night, shuffling closer on the bed. I couldn't possibly spend that long in the shower. It'd be far too risky. Grandma stared at me with those blue eyes of hers, unsmiling, and I knew it was time for one of her stories. One of the scary ones. I shivered with pleasure and pulled the covers up to my chin. Why is it risky, Grandma? She half turned to look out the window, watching me from the corner of her eye. Pausing for effect. I waited, feeling my heart rate pick up ever so slightly in my chest. Well, she said after a moment. It's only risky if you close your eyes, of course. If you close your eyes for longer than 10 seconds. What do you mean? Why? Well, do you ever play that game in the playground with your friends? The one where someone turns their back and the others sneak up on them when they're not looking? I nodded, and Grandma nodded back. Exactly. So that's what it's like in the shower when you have your eyes closed. That's what it's like with Mr. Longfingers. A cold itch tickled back. Who's Mr. Longfingers, Grandma? She let out a deep breath, as if she wished she hadn't said anything. Turned her head back to face mine. When she next spoke, she'd lowered her voice. No one knows, exactly, Grandma whispered. Some think it's a creature that's attracted to the heat and smell we give off in there. Others think it's a demon that finds a way into our realm through the dense steam clouds. No one can say for sure, because the only ones who have actually seen Mr. Longfingers aren't ever going to be able to tell you. I pulled in a breath. Why not? Grandma shuffled closer along the bed and leaned towards me, leaving my question hanging in the air. Don't you worry about it, sweetheart. Don't worry your pretty head. As long as you remember the rules, you'll be fine. What rules? Well, when you're in the shower, you try not to close your eyes for too long. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay, too. But any longer than that, yeah? Then what? Well, any longer than that and you may just start to feel something in the room with you. Something watching. And if you ever go longer than 15 seconds, that's when you might start to hear a noise, too. Hear what? The soft tap 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 of fingers on glass. Fingers drumming against the glass door of the shower. If you do ever hear that noise, God forbid, will you make me a promise? What, Grandma? Promise me you'll never open your eyes. I barely slept that night. Hardly at all. I'd close my eyes and try to relax, but every time I did I'd imagine a face pressed against my bedroom window, staring in at me. And when I did finally get to sleep, I had nightmares. Bad ones. I had them all week, in fact. Dreams about disembodied eyes watching me in the dark and long fingers reaching out to touch my exposed skin. It wasn't any better when I was awake, either. Not really. The shower was the worst. That's when Grandma's story really got to me. I'd never thought about it before, but suddenly I had trouble shutting my eyes in there. I'd be standing beneath the beading water, shampoo running down my face, and as soon as I squinted my eyelids closed, I'd hear Grandma's words running through my head. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay, too. But any longer than that I'd rub my hair fast, feeling the shampoo dripping off my chin, and as soon as I'd counted past 5 seconds I'd feel it. A sort of pressure. Not a feeling of being watched, exactly, but something close to that. I'd run my fingers faster and faster through my hair, frantically trying to get the suds out, and the ready blackness behind my closed eyes, coupled with the rush of water in my ears, would feel like a held breath. Like the silence before a scream. The seconds would race through my mind and I'd be so desperate to open my eyes again that I'd sometimes do it before my hair was rinsed fully clean and my eyes would sting with shampoo. But before I shut them again I'd always be sure to peer out through the steamed glass door of the shower cubicle. Just to make sure I was still alone. It wasn't long before Mum realized something was up. She heard me crying out in my sleep one night and came in to comfort me. Asked me what the matter was and it all came out. I told her about Grandma's stories and about Mr. Longfingers. She got this look on her face when I was telling her like she used to get with me when I'd made her really mad. This wide-eyed, angry look. Only this time she wasn't angry with me. She was angry with Grandma. My parents' room was next to mine, and sometimes, if I pressed my ear against a wall, I could hear them talking in there. Soft whispers. That night, though, after Mum was satisfied I wasn't scared anymore and she'd gone back to her room, the whispers weren't soft at all. Oh no. I heard Mum hissing to Dad about Grandma. About the story she'd told me. Mum's voice floated through the wall, sharp and crisp. You know what your fucking mother's said to him now, don't you, Simon? Dad's response was an unintelligible mutter. She's told him there's a monster that'll get him if he shuts his eyes in the shower. A monster. The poor kid's been having nightmares about it all week. Seriously, Simon, you'd better say something to her tomorrow morning, first thing. Or I will. Grandma came to visit me in my room the following night. That time, as she perched on the end of my bed, there were no stories. Nothing like that. Grandma just sat there and stared down at me, her blue eyes white and sad. The light from the moon outside my window lit up her wrinkled face. You know I'd never let anything bad happen to you, don't you? She said after a moment. I nodded my head. I know, Grandma. You know I wouldn't let you come to any harm? I nodded again. Okay, good. That's good. She looked away from me for a moment, out the window. You know, the things I tell you in the evening are meant to help you, sweetheart. They're meant to toughen you up a bit. Protect you. She paused and shook her head. But maybe your mum's right. Maybe I went too far this time. She looked down at me and smiled. But even then, even though I was only 10 years old, I could tell it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'll tell you what, Grandma said. You know what I told you about Mr. Longfingers and the shower? Well, I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'll scare the bastard off, how about that? It won't come back in a hurry if it has to face me. I stared up at Grandma, watching her face glow in the moonlight. Watching her smile down at me. I nodded my head, once. I was the one who found her. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I'd guess it was about a week after we had that talk in my room. A week after she told me she wouldn't let me come to any harm. I woke early that morning, from a bad dream, to a heavy thumping sound. I sat bolt upright in bed. My room was quiet around me, and I couldn't hear anything from the wall that joined my parents' room, either. But the house wasn't entirely silent. Floating down the hall, muffled by my closed door, I could hear the sound of rushing water. The noise of the shower. I leapt out of bed and ran down the upstairs hallway, heart already pounding in my chest. As soon as I reached the closed bathroom door, I started banging on it. A deep terror was welling up inside me like cold water from a well, something I couldn't place, and I kept banging and shouting Grandma. Over and over again, even though she didn't respond. Off to my right I was dimly aware of voices from my parents' room, the sleepy shuffle of footsteps, but before they had a chance to make it out onto the landing, I'd lifted my hand to test out the door handle, more out of instinct than because I thought it might actually open. But the door wasn't locked. I kept banging with my free hand and it swung suddenly inwards, bringing me face to face with a wall of steam. Heat struck my skin. I squinted my eyes against the damp fog and peered into the bathroom. And before Dad pushed me to one side before everything around me descended into shouting and tears and chaos, I saw her. I saw Grandma. She was lying naked on the floor in the shower cubicle, the water beating down around her. Blue eyes bulging from her face. One hand was curled against her chest like a dead bird, while the other trailed against the glass of the shower cubicle, the flailing finger marks she'd carved through the steam still clear and fresh. It was a heart attack that killed her. That's what my dad told me. He said Grandma was old and the thing had struck her quickly and suddenly. She would have died fast and without pain, Dad said. She wouldn't have suffered. I knew better, though. Even as a 10-year-old kid, I knew better. And years later, writing this as an adult, I still know better. I also know my wife and kids resent me for refusing to have a shower in the house. For insisting everyone take baths. They pretend it's okay, and they humor me, but I can tell they don't really understand it. Not at all. My wife thinks she does. She thinks I still carry the trauma of seeing my grandmother dying in front of me when I was little. I guess she's right, in a way. But she doesn't know the full truth. Nobody does. And no one would believe me even if I told them. No one would believe me if I said the reason I don't take showers, the reason I haven't had one since I was 10 years old, isn't because I'm scarred from the sight of a dead body. It's because all those years ago, when I crept back into the still hot bathroom after the paramedics had taken Grandma's body downstairs, I made sure to check the marks her fingers had carved through the steamed glass of the shower cubicle. And those marks weren't just on the inside. 3 new horrific true scary stories 7/5/2023. Number 1. Strange interview. I have to start out by saying right away that I am rather happily employed. I make decent money and my family is very well taken care of. Unfortunately, however, this was not always the case. This story happened near the beginning of the Great Recession. I am sure a lot of people can remember how bad things were back then. I worked as a facilitator in a call center company. My entire job was training people about how to work on the phones. It was a 3-week course for each class, and once it was done, it started over with a new class. So, the company decided not to use full-time facilitators anymore. Apparently, they considered us a money drain. So, what they did instead was use call center workers in the summer and fall to do the training. They were paid less than we were and didn't get a bonus for doing the training, so off we went. I had severance for a few months. But that was hardly a comfort. I had children and I needed to find a job in order to take care of them. And everyone was cutting employees, not hiring them, so I was not having any luck in finding a job. When I was in the parking lot of a grocery store, a somewhat friend of mine came over to talk to me. She was one of those annoying people who always trapped you in a conversation and wouldn't let go. Plus, she was really weird and into some shady things. I knew that she sold drugs on the side because she had offered me some every now and then. Of course I declined and she stopped talking about it. She asked me if I had found a new job yet. I told her that I did not. And it was getting a bit difficult as the severance money was running out. I had no idea what I was going to do if I couldn't find a job before that, and my savings were depleted. That is when she told me that she might be able to help me find a job. I was dubious about it because of her history and insisted that I didn't want to do anything illegal. She assured me that it wasn't anything like that. She took out a piece of paper with a phone number on it and told me just to call that number and to mention that she was the one who told me to call. And then, for the first time ever, she left the talk before I did. It was weird and I really didn't trust her. But after a while, I decided that it couldn't hurt to just try out the number and see what was going on. So I called and someone picked up on the second ring. They said the name of the business, something that I had never heard of before, and asked how they could help me. I gave them all the information that my friend had given me, and they told me they could set up an interview the next day. I was given an address and they hung up the phone. I was quite excited because it seemed legit, and I really hadn't expected it to be. I would be able to go to the interview immediately after I had dropped the kids off at school. I didn't have a GPS or anything, so I had to find the place on my own. I drove and when I was getting closer, I realized that this was in a rather seedy part of town. In fact, it was an area with a lot of industrial buildings that had been closed down. Therefore, there were no car or anything in the area. I kept checking the addresses, trying to find the right one. Eventually, I found it because I recalled the name of the company. But it was weird to me because there were no cars in the parking lot at all. I guessed to myself that maybe the employees parked in the back. Plus I didn't think much of it because the business could definitely be running even with the other closed ones in the area. I got parked in what was marked a spot for guests. And then I got out of the car. I walked up to the building, but as I did, I started to get very nervous. It didn't look like anyone was in the building. And it was scary walking up to it like this. I walked up to the door and opened it. It was unlocked and at first, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was thinking I had been sent to a closed building. I went in. My relief quickly left me. There was no one at the reception desk, there were not any lights on, and the place was definitely deserted. I walked over to the elevator, pushing the button. Maybe the reception area was closed, but the place I was supposed to work at was open, I asked myself. But there was no power and the elevator did nothing. I stood there for a moment, not sure what I was going to do. And that's when I heard it. I heard a really odd voice saying something. But I couldn't make it totally out. It seemed to be coming from the staircase by the elevators. So I decided to go and open the door and hear what was being said. I opened the door and immediately wished that I hadn't. A loud scary voice was chanting over and over, "It's for you, Lord, come to me, Lord. It's for you, Lord, come to me, Lord." The voice was coming from down the stairs in the basement of the building. I was frozen for a moment, but then decided to close the door quietly. I didn't know what was going on in that basement, but it had nothing to do with a job interview. I intended to walk out of the building quietly, but my fear got the best of me. I ran out of the building and got into my car. As I was driving out, I noticed several people standing in front of the building, watching me leave. They weren't dressed like business people, though. They were wearing like ceremonial robes or something. They just watched me as I left, speeding away from this freaky sight. When I got home, I went to call my friend who had suggested that I go there. She didn't answer the phone. She didn't return my message. I never spoke to her or saw her again. I have no idea what really happened that day and really hope I never find out. Number 2. Playground. I work out a lot. I have always been really obsessed with keeping fit. I have also had training in wrestling and some martial arts. Although I don't particularly like the idea of fighting, I think I could do more than hold my own in a fight. This is pretty important to know because it makes my story that much scarier. Now, this happened in the fall. So of course the sun had been setting a whole lot earlier. I like to get out and jog right before the sunset because it was nice to watch the fall sunset. So, I was jogging and I decided to cut through this park. It was a pretty big area with a path running through the forest. And when you came out of the forest, the path went by a big field with children's playground equipment in the middle of the field. When I was running past the playground, I stopped to get a look at the sunset. And when I did, I noticed that there was a kid in the playground. They looked pretty young and I thought it was weird that they were out so late. I was about to just start jogging again when I noticed something else. Some strange-looking man was standing outside of the playground. He moved forward a little bit and leaned against a swing set for a while. I don't know why I stood there and watched, but there was something about the guy that made me feel pretty uneasy. I wasn't sure if he saw me or not because his back was facing me the whole time. But he hadn't been in the playground when I first showed up, so I doubted that he was the parent of the child. The man walked up to the kid. They looked like they were talking. I noticed the kid back off a little from the man, and the kid looked a bit scared. So I began to get a little concerned but didn't do anything quite yet. However, the kid stood up and then began to back away from the man. I thought I would go up to them and see what was wrong. So I began lightly jogging up to the playground. After a moment, however, the man grabbed the kid by the arm. The kid was doing his best to struggle and move away, but the man had a good grip on him. That is when the kid began yelling and I realized this person was either an abusive parent or a child abductor. Either way, I knew I had to act fast. I ran up to the guy and grabbed the arm that was holding the kid. I jerked his arm away and the kid got loose and fell to the ground. I twirled the guy around so that he was facing me. I got a good look at the guy and he was a scary-looking man. He was thin, pale and looked like he hadn't washed his greasy hair in a long time. It was nasty looking. But the worst part were his eyes, which looked totally crazed. The man, who was much smaller than me, jumped on me and tried to knock me over. I was surprised because I was much bigger than him, but he succeeded in tackling me to the ground. The guy was abnormally strong, and the fight was one of the hardest ones I ever had in my life. He kept yelling something about needing the blood and all. Finally, however, I was able to subdue him by getting him on his stomach and holding his arms behind his back with my left hand and my knee. I tossed my cell phone over to the kid and told him to call 911. He didn't hesitate to do so. I held the struggling man down until the police arrived. They took over and arrested him. But that's not the end of the story. I was there when the kid was talking to the cops, and the story he told them was scary. The kid told the police that the man approached him, asking to play a game. The kid was immediately put off. He didn't want to play with a stranger, especially a stranger as freaky as this guy was. When the kid backed off, the man grabbed him and started growling at the kid, telling the kid that he keeps seeing the scary things. He told the kid that he needed to drain his blood in order to take care of the visions. The guy was on some pretty serious drugs, and he was also mentally ill. He suffered from schizophrenia, and the drugs made it worse. He was on PCP. It was the first time I had ever been around someone who was on PCP. It also explains how the little man was able to put up a good fight with me. It chilled me to think about the fight after that, because who knows what he could have done to me if he had won the fight. But most fortunately, the kid was alright. He wasn't too freaked out about the whole thing, and that is most important. Number 3. Night home. I am not completely sure if these two events are related, but they might be. I had an extremely messy breakup with a girl when I was in my 20s, which was a long time ago. It was like something you would see out in a movie. We yelled and screamed, called names and threw things at each other. It ended with her and me screaming as she left the house. I was at the door and screaming back as she walked to her car and supposedly drove her way out of my life. I didn't hear from her for the rest of the week. In fact, I was relieved that I didn't. I knew it would just lead to more drama and stuff. I was just hoping that everything would get back to normal and I would never see her again. So it was on the weekend when I was home by myself that I had an experience that part of my thinks was instigated by her. I had gotten home pretty late on a Saturday night after having been out at the bars with some friends of mine. I wasn't ready to go to bed though, so I decided to keep having a few drinks in my home. Hey, I knew that I was going to pay for it in the morning, but that was fine with me at the time. I had my television beside the window that faced out in my living room. That way, I could just look over and always see what was going on outside. Not that much was actually going on ever, but if it was, I would know it. I guess you could also say I am paranoid, and if I am watching TV and someone comes to the door, I want to be able to see who it is before they get here. But normally, I don't pay much attention if I see someone walking on the sidewalk in front of my house. It's normally just kids that do it. But this night, I did notice someone walking by. And it was because the guy was pretty big and rather scary looking as well. He was also overly dressed for what the weather was like. But really got my attention was that he looked over at my house. I wasn't sure if he could see me or not, but I sure could see him. But after the glance over to my house, he kept walking on his way. I really put him immediately out of my head. I went back to watching TV for a little while. Feeling that I wanted another drink, I got up and went in the kitchen. There was a sliding glass door facing my backyard. I normally don't pay much attention to the backyard, but when I turned out the lights, I don't know why, but I glanced into the backyard. At first, I couldn't make out what I saw. But I knew that it looked like someone or something was in my backyard. It was a shadowy figure. For a few moments, I thought that it might be my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. So I walked up closer to the window to get a better look. I couldn't turn my porch light on because the bulb was out. I was looking and then realized that there was indeed someone in my backyard. They were standing far enough back in the dark that I couldn't see them clearly. But it looked like a big man, and my mind went back to the man I had seen walking in front of my house. He must have realized that I had seen him because he began moving quickly toward my door. The door was fortunately closed, but it wasn't locked. So I had to move quickly to flick the lock switch. I fortunately did before the guy got to the handle. At this point, I was able to get a look at the guy. He was huge and was wearing a black jacket. His jacket opened as he moved, and I saw a large knife sheathed inside of the jacket. That scared the crap out of me. The man started pulling on the handle of the door. Although it was locked, he was mercilessly pulling on the handle. I was terrified that he might break the lock and get through. I ran into the living room closet and grabbed something in there that I had to protect myself. I kept hearing him pulling on that door handle and eventually heard break the lock and get the door open. He got into my house. I stood in the doorway to the closet as the man came into the house. When I saw him, he had already pulled his knife out of its sheath. But when he saw me, he stopped in his tracks when he saw me pointing my gun straight at his head. "Get the fuck out of my house," I breathed. I was the one suddenly with the more power, but I was terrified. I didn't really know if I could shoot a person. I had never been in a situation to shoot anything other than a target. I just hoped that he didn't hear the fear in my voice. He took one step forward toward me, as if daring me to shoot at him. At that moment, it seemed like my body took over and pulled the trigger. The shot hit the guy in his left arm. He quickly recoiled and yelled in pain. However, he didn't keep still very long, and he got up and ran out of the back door of the house. I actually stood there for who knows how long, still terrified about what happened. I knew I needed to get up and call the police. But I was frozen in place for a while. Finally, I called the police. They looked around and I gave a description of the guy. Interestingly enough, the guy was picked up when he was found lurking behind a convenience store. I actually had to go to the precinct and there was a lineup and I was able to identify him. The reason I brought my girlfriend up in the beginning was that she knew this guy. I suspected that she had set this up, but that was never proven, and she was never arrested. But the attacker did get a short jail sentence for aggravated assault. Growing up, I had a best friend named Lloyd. We grew up as regular country boys, having all sorts of fun. We collected baseball cards together, we played with our toy guns, went to the pool, and did just about everything together. When my dad took me hunting for the first time, Lloyd came along. So growing up, we really just did about everything together. This happened when the two of us were in high school. Lloyd and I both lived off a rural route, way out of town. This was a very poor area, and we both lived in pretty old, run-down houses. This was in the 1980s. We had grown up in the 70s and early 80s. My family was fortunate enough to have a color television, but we didn't have anything like cable. But this didn't matter too much to us kids because of the stuff we did was outside. It was a really hot summer night when this happened. Lloyd was over at my house, which was usual. We were both 16 years old at the time. We had been in my room, listening to music pretty much all night. After a while, though, we had begun to get a little bored. Lloyd wanted to smoke a couple joints that he had on him. He thought that we could get away with it in my room, but there was no way I would let him. I wouldn't take the chance of my dad smelling it. I don't really know if we would have gotten in trouble for it or not, but there was no way that I was going to take a chance. We lived right on the edge of a huge forest. It was a place that we had explored in, hunted in, hanged out in, and even smoked joints in before. I let Lloyd know that if he wanted to smoke, then we should probably go for a walk in the woods. It was already past midnight, but that was no big deal. We had often gone for walks really late at night. My dad was still awake and watching television. We let him know that we were bored and were going to go for a walk. He didn't care, just told us to be careful, but just take a flashlight with us. He also suggested I take my rifle out with me, which I decided to do just to make him happy. This was back in the 1980s, and we lived in an extremely rural area, so it wasn't unusual for a kid my age to have his own gun. So we set out. We began smoking as soon as we got out into the woods. It was extremely dark outside, so we began using the flashlight right away. There were some paths to walk on, created by years of people simply walking through the big forest, and we just walked along them, deeper and deeper into the trees. For a while into our walk, it was just a normal walk. We didn't have anything happen or hear anything out of the ordinary. But after a while, we noticed something lying off to the side of the path that we were on. When we got closer, we were pretty shocked by what he had seen. There was a dead deer lying on the ground. This in itself was not unusual, but it was cut up pretty bad. It was like some animal had killed it and mauled it a bit, eating a lot of it in the area that it was wounded in. What was weird, though, was that plenty of the edible parts of the deer were left over. It seemed strange to both of us that any animal would have done this and left so much meat. "Hey, what did we run into a bobcat or something that did this?" Lloyd asked me. I held up my rifle. "That's what we have this for," I said. Don't misunderstand me, however. I wouldn't go looking for a bobcat to kill, but I would absolutely use my rifle to protect myself from one, however. We didn't think a whole lot about it and kept walking through the woods and smoking. Except now we were listening to the noises around us more closely. We were talking about the possibility of a bobcat, and I guess the more we talked about it, the more we convinced ourselves that there might be one out there. However, we absolutely were not scared. I don't know how long we were out or when we decided to turn around and head back toward my house. But we eventually did, and it was probably pretty late. We were probably pretty stoned at that point too, but not more than we were used to being. It was on the way back that Lloyd began getting a little paranoid. He kept telling me that he was hearing things in the woods. I wasn't hearing any of the noises that he described and I told him he was just stoned. But he was confident that he heard something out there. He was confident that he heard something walking out in the woods. He began getting really worried that a bobcat or another animal was out there and was stalking us. I, though, didn't hear the noises that he had been talking about. The more we walked along, the more paranoid that Lloyd got. He kept asking me, whispering over and over, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And I hadn't heard any of the things that he had been talking about. When we crossed back toward the area that we originally had seen the deer, we were surprised to see that it wasn't there. This just increased Lloyd's paranoia, and he began scanning the area, trying to see if an animal was dragging it off somewhere. Holy shit. I heard his whisper and he grabbed my arm. Lloyd made me look over into the woods, but he wouldn't shine the flashlight in that direction. Although it was dark, I could see what looked like a rather large figure out in the woods. It was moving too. I grabbed the flashlight from him and shined it over at whatever it was that we were looking at. We saw the deer, but whatever the big figure was, that obviously was pulling it, quickly got out of the way before we could see what it was. However, we had both seen it. For the first time, I was as scared as Lloyd was or even more. I didn't know who or what we saw, but after what we remembered from seeing the deer and then what we had seen in the dark, I knew someone or something was out there. To let them know that we were armed, I took my rifle and I shot one shot into the air. I was hoping that would scare whomever it was away. "We need to get out of here," Lloyd told me. I agreed and the two of us began jogging along the path to get out of the woods. We were scared that anything that might have killed that deer and was pulling it away could be frighteningly dangerous. We just wanted to get as far away from it as possible. We weren't aware if it tried following us. But we got out of the woods as fast as we could. What we had seen was not very far from my house. So we both rushed into the house and locked the doors behind us. It was hot outside and we usually kept the doors open, and they were always unlocked. So this was a rare thing. The two of us went and hid out in my room. We kept the gun out with us, fully loaded. We didn't sleep at all that night. I guess that shouldn't really be surprising. About a month later, a really big guy was arrested in the woods not far from our house. Apparently he had attacked a police officer who had stopped to question him. I have no doubt that it was the same man. I used to always enjoy taking my dog on a walk through the woods every day. I lived out in the country by myself. For the most part, when I took my dog for a walk, I would take him through the same area every time. However, one day I decided to travel out in a completely different direction, and that resulted in me seeing the strangest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was nothing more than a decision made out of boredom. But I took my dog alongside the dirt roads past a driveway and then out into the hills that were opposite my house. Like my normal walks, we were out for a long time. We weren't hunting or anything, but my dog and I liked to take really long walks in the country as if we were. I didn't even have to leash him, as he never went too far from me and always came back. Besides being a little more dense than the forest that we usually walked along in, this wasn't much different than that. We were having a good time walking through the woods and enjoying what we were seeing. My dog, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that his name is Roscoe, had been running around looking at things. He had beaten me over the top of the hill, and I was trying to get up there to check on him. But before I even made it to the top, he came running back over the hill to me. When he caught up to me, he turned and tried to lead me up the hill all over again. "Did you find something interesting, boy?" I asked him. Roscoe turned and began running back over the hill. I stepped up my pace and made it over the hill to see where he was going. Once I made it over the hill, I noticed something that really surprised me. There looked like there was an old cabin on the other side of the hill. And since Roscoe was over right by the cabin, I figured that was what he was barking about. I really didn't want to bother anyone who was living out in the woods like that. I knew better than to get involved with them. So I tried calling Roscoe over and over, trying to get him to come back to me. But for some reason, he wouldn't. It wasn't unusual for him, however, to not come when I called him. He could be a bit stubborn at times. I was very nervous when I walked up to him. He was barking or anything, so it was possible that anyone living in the cabin hadn't heard him out there. So I did my best to be as quiet as possible, and I tried to go up to Roscoe so I could grab him by the collar and lead him away. As I got up to him, I looked over to the side of the cabin that I hadn't seen before. I noticed something really strange. There was a tree that was really close to the side of the cabin. Hanging from this tree were all sorts of shoes. They were all pairs of shoes, some of them in many different sizes. They all had their strings tied together, and then the strings were tied to different branches on the tree. Most of them looked like they had been up on the tree for a long time, beaten by the weather. However, some of the shoes in the tree looked like they were put there more recently and were not as weathered. All in all, it was the weirdest thing that I had ever seen before. Also the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. I tried to be as quiet as I could as I led Roscoe away from the area. I thought if I led him down the hill, we would get to the road and I could just take that back home. As we kept going down the hill, though, I kept smelling something pretty nasty. It just got worse and worse until we got to the bottom of the hill. And at the bottom I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen in my life. There was like a pile of what appeared to be rotted and decaying roadkill or something on the bottom of that hill. It was vile and I had to do everything I could to keep from puking. I just had Roscoe by the collar and led him away from it. We eventually got back to the dirt road. I used it and took my dog home with me. I don't know what I actually saw that day. Between the weird shoe tree and the pile of roadkill, it was just the weirdest shit. But then again, a lot of times if you go hiking where you're not supposed to, you will see the weirdest shit. New neighbor. I inherited my parents' home when they both passed away when I was in my early 20s. I wasn't in a relationship and didn't have any children, so I moved in alone. It was a pretty big house to live in alone, but I didn't want to get rid of it or sell it or anything. So I stayed in it for quite a long time by myself. So I was a single female living in a big house in town all by myself. My next door neighbors, or at least the ones who owned the house, didn't live there. However, they rented the house out to several people throughout the time that I had been alive. I had neighbors that I played with their children while growing up, and also had people who lived there who we never spoke to at all. And when I owned the house, not much changed. Well, about 2 years after I inherited the house, the people who rented the house next door moved out, and it stayed empty for about a month or so. When someone finally moved in, I came outside onto the porch to see who it was. I always liked to greet whoever moved in. Like my house, it was a big 3-bedroom, family-sized home, so I expected a family moving in. When I went over to greet the man who was moving in, I quickly realized that he was moving in all by himself. He didn't have a family moving in. And it wasn't surprising why. There was something very off and something very creepy about the guy that I noticed right away. He absolutely wasn't very talkative at all and kept looking at me in a way that made me very uncomfortable. When I excused myself and went back to my home, I just decided this was not going to be one of the more friendly neighborhood relationships that I was going to have. But it didn't bother me because I figured that like most of these neighbors over the years, he wouldn't be here forever anyway. So, things just continued to be strange with him as the weeks passed. He wouldn't really talk to me, but if I came out of the house and he was on his porch, he would stare at me the entire time that I was outside. His eyes would follow me to my car and watch me as I drove away. I guess I should have worried about him breaking into my house and maybe stealing stuff, but I never did. I could always tell from his eyes that this was not what was important to him. He seemed like he was interested in me for some reason. So after time, things kept up like that. I came to the conclusion that he was pretty harmless. But not so long after that, I had seen him watching me from the windows of his house whenever he could catch a glimpse of me. That was much creepier than him just watching me from his porch, but I still tried not to think about it too much. Then one night, about 7 months after I moved in, I had gotten home pretty late from work. I just wanted to have a couple glasses of wine and take a bath. I was doing a good job at finally relaxing after a very stressful work day. My bathroom was on the second floor of the house. So, after I was done with my bath, I dried off and then put on my robe. I decided to go down to the second floor and get myself another glass of wine. I was walking around in the dark, like I normally do. I have very good night vision. I got the bottle out of the refrigerator and poured a glass, keeping the door open. And then, I replaced a bottle inside. When the door was open, it faced the back of my house and blocked my back door. I closed it and the kitchen of course went dark again when the light went out. After the couple of seconds it took for my eyes to adjust, I saw something out of the back window. It was only for a few moments, but I was sure of it. It was a man who was looking in the back window of my house, and there was no doubt at all that it was my next door neighbor. Then, within a moment, he was gone. I didn't scream or anything, but I did grab my phone, and I called the police. I let them know exactly what I had seen. Well, I didn't have any proof that the man was at my back door. But in a moment of irony, I really didn't need it. The scariest revelation of my life also ended up being the thing that helped me. The police revealed to me that my neighbor was a convicted sex offender. But the reason they didn't need proof that he was at my door to arrest him was because he hadn't registered as one even long before he moved in. So, he went to jail and was evicted as my neighbor. I was scared to death when I was told this by the police. It made me think of the possibilities with a person like that living next door. It was a good thing I caught him when I did. True story time. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and my parents had just separated. My mom was living in a 2-bedroom apartment, I had my own room, but I preferred to sleep in her bed whenever I was staying with her. Our two bedrooms were at the end of a hallway, directly across from each other. Our apartment was on the first floor and I remember that it was in the middle of the summer and my mom had a window open her room, which was directly behind the bed, above the headboard. Anyways, I woke up in the middle of the night and remember sitting up and seeing that our cat was sitting in the doorframe of my mom's room. Her door was open and you could partially see into my bedroom. This was strange because our cat was typically always in bed with us. As I was watching him, he walked into my bedroom and meowed. I turned to face my mom and wake her up. In the 3-4 seconds it took her to wake up and ask me what was wrong, we both looked back up in the doorframe and there was a man standing by my open door, making his way out of my bedroom. I still don't know how she managed to do it so quickly, but my mother proceeded to pick me up and literally throw me out of the screen window. Again, we were on the first floor and it was maybe a 3-foot drop to the ground. She quickly followed and we were able to start screaming for help and someone called 911. The police came but didn't see any signs of forced entry. Only that our front door was unlocked, which led them to believe the man must have exited that way. The strange thing was that my mom swore up and down that she had locked the door that night with the deadbolt and chain lock. About a week later she was cleaning the kitchen and opened up our water heater closet and found a notebook with names and drawings, as well as a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The police were called again, but all they could do was speculate that the man had been in our house and hid until we were asleep. A terrifying but true story I experienced when I was 12. I moved to my dad's when I was 10 and didn't know anyone in the area except for the family my dad was friends with. Single mom with 3 kids, luckily there was a girl a couple years older than me, 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over a couple years. We weren't close, but ended up having the same friends. One night my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone because my friend's mom was at work. Which is where this gets terrifying and sad. Her mother has been helping this one lady through her work and got to know her fairly well. She found out her sister was in a mental institution and was let out recently. The night Rob is hanging out with my friend, they get a knock on the door. My friend thought it was just their mom. She knocks a certain way when coming in and answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there and he took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. Wasn't her mom. It was the sister of the lady her mom was helping, and she figured out through talking to her sister where her family lived and her mom's working schedule. She came in, and this is where is don't know details, and I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbors to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week from Christmas. Decapitated her and left her body, naked in a bathtub. Hit her head. They had to look through the presents and I don't know where they found it, but they did. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. Indian ghost story. Location? Assam, India. This takes place around 2108. I am doing a government job and at that time was posted in a rural area near Bhutan border. So, office times were lax and I usually headed back home around 2ish. Since villages usually have flaky electricity supply and I was heavy into gaming at that time, I decided to rent at the nearby town and would commute to office on my motorcycle for around 35 kilometers. The road was pitched and well maintained, but there were no houses around and sparse forest areas for the entirety of around 20 kilometers till the road merges with the national highway. So, coming to that eventful afternoon, I was riding back home at around 3 p.m. and had covered around half the way. The roads were usually vacant with a rare car overtaking you or a man with his cattle. So, your peripheral vision tends to be very active and if you spot someone or something, you look. Here I see this lady, in tribal garb, walking on my side of the road. Around 30ish, I would assume. When I overtake, I look in my rear mirror to see her face. Surprise, surprise, nobody there. I stop my bike. Big mistake. But in my mind, this was a spooky adventure and in broad daylight, mind you, so rather than getting afraid, I decide to investigate. The area was mostly bamboo trees with no houses on either side, so it was not possible for her to get off the road and be somewhere. So, after a few seconds of looking, I take a leak and head back home. The rest of the evening is spent playing games and eating dinner. Nothing unusual. I go to bed around 1 p.m. At around 3 p.m., I suddenly wake up with an intense feeling of dread. I open my eyes but cannot move my body. Sleep paralysis, I think. I have had similar attacks quite a few times before, so I know how to deal with it. I do not try to move my body, I just close my eyes and wait for it to end. Suddenly I find myself being embraced from behind by cold hands. I can feel the coldness radiate through my body. Now I feel nervous. I have never seen apparitions or felt any presence in my previous sleep paralysis bouts. I nervously squeak, "Who's there?" After a few seconds, I hear a female voice, not harsh, but sweet and melodious. "You don't know me. What will you do with my name?" I am seriously a mess at this point. I croak out, "Please leave me alone." She says, "I am not leaving you. I will be with you forever." I manage a "Why?" And the answer is, "Because you were looking for me." I don't know when I slept. The next day, I came down with a high fever and decided to skip office. That day I was a wreck of nerves. I was afraid to sleep alone. I was alone in a new town and my parents were in a different end of the state, so asking them to come down was not a feasible question. That night, same situation, I feel the embrace again. But this time I pretend like I do not feel anything. I lay still and feverishly pray. I hear the voice, "Do you not like me?" I do not reply. The voice repeats, "Do you not like me? My husband did not want me, so he killed me. Go to X village and ask." Said village is a small habitation, around 15 to 20 homes and a tea grocery shop nearly 3 kilometers from the place first mentioned. I will never leave you now. I do not know when I went to sleep. Next morning, I get ready to go to office. Today, I need to get to the bottom of this mystery. I reach office and confide in my attendant, let's call him Ram, he was a local of the place. So, Ram and I head off to this place on my bike. We head for the tea shop and strike up a conversation with the owner. Chatty fellow. He tells Ram in their local language that the wife of a woodcutter who stayed there was found mysteriously dead by hanging a few days back. Local authorities declared it a suicide, but the info was that the couple were constantly fighting and overall it was an unhappy marriage. Reasons: the lady did not conceive after 5 years of marriage. The husband was obviously grieving and stuff, but tongues were wagging about how he had done off with his wife. I now knew what I needed to know. Ram takes me to a local tantric who asks me to narrate everything in detail. I spill all the beans. He says I was a fool to stop there and God was with me that I was not dead in these 2 days. According to him, people who get their lives snuffed out are usually malevolent after their deaths. They do not know right from wrong and vent out their anger on any poor soul who happens to cross their path. And silly me had to pee there of all places. He performs a puja for me and gives me the ashes. He said, "Spread these on your entrance and near your bed and do not clean them off for 7 days. He takes only $20 from me as payment. I do what I am told and that was the last time I was bothered by this entity. To conclude, the logical mind would assume sleep paralysis and my colored mind to be the reason for this experience. I would beg to differ for a few reasons. First, I am not sure you have a coherent conversation during sleep paralysis. Some people do see things, but the way she talked to me and narrated the place of her death does raise questions. Secondly, I have never had sleep paralysis for 2 nights continuously in my life. Thirdly, at the first instance when I saw her on the road, how could she disappear in a split second with no place to be or hide for a few miles? I feel that this experience have opened my eyes and broadened my horizon. I am no longer an naysayer. There are indeed some things which we may never know about for certain, but which will continue to elude us and sometimes give us a small peek into their existence. Please share your experiences for our reading pleasure. My name is Jessica. I have a few true stories. Story 1: There is something wrong with my mom. I am a 32 female. My name is Jessica, and one time when I was 7 and my little brother Jacob was 5, we went to go and visit our parents for the weekend. My parents lost custody due to being in and out of jail, being on drugs, and my mother was abusive towards me. She was not as abusive toward my little brother Jacob for some reason I never understood. So we are visiting them at their 1-bedroom first-floor apartment. It was during Halloween time. I remember this because we made little ghosts with cloth and string and made them move and fly with the string. We are all hanging out and it's going good. My parents' friend Jesse comes by to visit. He is a longtime friend of theirs and me and my brother would call him Cousin Jesse. My mom starts acting weird. She just seems off for some reason. It was like a switch. She was normal, but then weird. My dad notices and takes her to the room, and then my dad comes back in the living room, where we are all sitting. Then I hear my parents' door open and we all turn and see my mom standing there just staring at us with her head out of the door. My dad goes in the room with her for a little bit. Then I hear hammering in the room. My dad comes out and I see that he has a hammer and nails. He walks to the front door, locks it and hammers the door shut so it can't be opened. He sits down on the couch and I can tell he is stressed from his facial expression. I hear the bedroom door open and see my mom crawling out the room. Seeing this freaks me out and I am crying. My dad goes over to her and takes her into the room. He come back and not too long after he sits back down, she crawls back out the room and she is holding my little brown bear I got from my Happy Meal from McDonald's. She is calling my brother and I and telling us to come play with her. We say no and she starts to cry and says to come to her. I'm bawling and my little brother is crying. My dad is trying to get her back into the room. She gets up and runs to me and my brother. He and I are screaming and crying running away from her. She is chasing us in the living room yelling to play with her. We go to cousin Jesse and hid behind him. My dad picks my mom up and takes her into the room. She is crying and yelling no no nanu uo. My dad then runs out of the room and gets the hammer and goes back to the room and I hear him nailing the door shut, locking them both inside. Well, cousin Jesse, my brother and I are just in the living room shocked. My brother and I fall asleep. I don't remember what happened the next day and I honestly wished I didn't remember the story, which was a horrible childhood memory. Now that I am an adult, I know that my mom was on drugs and having a bad trip or was so high she wanted to just play with us. Thanks for letting me share. Shadow person at grandma's and grandpa's. When I was little I lived with my grandparents on my dad's side. My mom was abusive and an addict. She was doing drugs while pregnant with me and gave birth to me addicted. My father was an addict too and let this happen. So my grandparents took me in. I remember being little, like 8 or 9, and seeing things from my peripheral vision. It was a black figure. I usually would see it while I was sitting and watching television in the living room. It was always staring from the hallway. I would turn to try and see it thinking it was one of my grandparents checking on me, but it would always be gone. I would never see it directly in front of me, it was always just in my peripheral vision. When I was older, maybe 18 or 19, I would have sleep paralysis. I would be sleeping on my back in my bedroom and I would feel like my bed was shaking. Then I would not be able to move or talk. I would try to break free and was able to break free a couple of times, but it was so hard. Usually I would just fall asleep. I would always see a shadow person while the sleep paralysis was happening. I saw it, but it was blurry, like staticky. This one time I could not break free and I was crying and I thought about praying. I'm not religious, but I do believe in a higher power, which to me is God. So I just said God is with me and I am on his side. When I thought those words, the sleep paralysis and shadow person just left. While I was having sleep paralysis, I wasn't able to move and talk. Every time this happened I felt weak and tired, like if I closed my eyes I could fall back asleep. This only happened at my grandparents' apartment. I have no idea why. They are the most bright, positive, loving people I have ever known. Thanks for letting me share my story. Crackhead lady on Gramercy Place. When I was 15, I had a boyfriend I met while visiting my grandparents. I was living in a foster home, and then I would go visit my grandparents every other weekend and on summer vacation. I would hang out a lot with my boyfriend and his friends a lot. We would all go sneak into my old elementary school Pio Pico, and I would watch them play basketball. One time while waiting for one of our friends to come hang out, an older lady came up to us. She looked like she did a lot of drugs and her eyes were big and bloodshot. She was really skinny too. They guys were all talking to her and I remember my boyfriend would tell me about this older lady that would come by and talk to them and give them free weed. They called her Auntie. So she was obviously on something. She was looking at me weird, like she was angry that I was there. She was holding a little axe. The ones that are used to chop things. She also had a big chunk of flesh missing on her top forehead. She was telling them about how the guy was trying to get her, so she had to chop him and started to chop at a tree by us, and one of the guys was like, "No, Auntie," jokingly. I was thinking, is this her normal behavior, because they didn't seem as afraid. I wanted to cry and run away. She kept looking at me like she knew that I was scared and wanted to run. I thought she was going to attack me because she is looking and standing towards me, and my boyfriend went in front of me. She just kept talking and I stood behind him. One of the guys was like, "All right, Auntie, we will talk to you later," and started to walk, and we all followed, and as we were all waking I looked back and she was just staring at us with a blank stare. So creepy, I thought I was about to get attacked. Don't do drugs, guys.